She stood at the top of the grand staircase, the silk of her gown cool against her skin, and watched her husband pass her without a word. It was their second wedding anniversary, and he had not even glanced at her face. The great hall of Ashwood Hall stretched below her, candlelight flickering across polished floors, and not a single soul noticed that the Duchess had worn the deep blue gown he once paused to admire in a shop window months ago. She had saved for it quietly, pinching pennies from her small allowance, believing that tonight might be different. But the Duke of Ashford walked past her like a shadow passing a pillar, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the carved doors of his study. His boots echoed. The door closed, and Alara was still standing there, her fingers trembling on the banister, a smile she had practiced all afternoon dying before it ever reached her lips. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. Instead, she descended the stairs slowly, each step a small surrender, and made her way to the empty dining room where two places had been set. The candles had burned low. The flowers she had arranged from the garden were beginning to wilt. She sat alone at the long table, folded her hands in her lap, and finally allowed herself to understand what she had been trying to ignore for 2 years. Her husband would never love her. The first year she had hoped. When Cale Ashford, the cold and formidable Duke of Ashford, had appeared at her aunt's modest home in the countryside and announced, with clipped formality, that he would honor her father's dying wish and marry her, Alara had been too shocked to speak. She was an orphan of minor gentry, raised by a bitter aunt who made no secret of her resentment. The Duke was a man of immense power, stern beauty, and a reputation for emotional stone. But he had looked at her that day with something that might have been duty softened by pity, and she had let herself believe that perhaps, over time, that look would warm. Perhaps he had chosen her because he saw something in her no one else had. She had been so wrong. The marriage was conducted quietly in the estate chapel. No guests, no celebration. The Duke spoke his vows as if reciting a contract, and when the priest pronounced them man and wife, he had touched her hand only to slide a heavy signet ring onto her finger before dropping it. That night he escorted her to a beautiful set of chambers far from his own, and informed her that she would want for nothing, that her position as Duchess of Ashford would be respected, and that he expected discretion and dignity in return. He did not visit her again as a husband. In 2 years, he had not once entered her room after dark. He had never kissed her beyond a formal brush of lips against her knuckles at public events. He had never said her name with tenderness. The worst part was the silence. They dined together occasionally when he remembered to appear. He would ask after her health, inquire about the household accounts, and then retreat into his study while his dinner grew cold. If she tried to speak of anything beyond practical matters, his gaze would turn distant, and she would feel herself becoming smaller and smaller until she excused herself. She learned to measure her worth in the number of words he gave her. Some days, it was no more than 3. But still she had hoped. She had told herself that men like Cale did not know how to express affection, that his coldness was a shield, that his past had wounded him. His first wife had died years before Alara ever met him, and the servants whispered that he had been different once before that loss. So she made excuses. She arranged his favorite flowers in his study. She learned the names of all his tenants and visited them so that he would hear reports of her kindness. She wore the colors he once mentioned suited her, and every night she waited, listening for footsteps that never came. The anniversary was the final thread. She had planned a quiet evening, just the two of them. She had asked the cook to prepare his favorite dishes. She had written him a letter, a gentle, honest letter telling him that she admired him and wished to be a true companion, not merely a household ornament. She had tucked it into her sleeve. But when he strode past her without a single glance, the letter became ash in her heart. She rose from the empty dining room, walked to her chambers, and placed the unread letter into a drawer. Then she looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back had tired eyes and a mouth shaped by too much silence. She was 24 years old and she felt ancient. She whispered to her reflection, "No more." The next morning she did not come down for breakfast. For the first time in 2 years, She did not prepare a tray of tea and place it outside his study door. Instead, she dressed in a simple walking gown and left the great house before dawn, walking the long path through the gardens and down to the village. The air was crisp and cool, and the world felt wider than the walls of Ashwood Hall. She breathed differently, as though she had been holding her breath for years and only just realized it. In the village, she stopped at the small orphanage run by a weary widow named Mrs. Tibbet. Alara had visited once before, bringing baskets of bread, but she had always felt like a visitor, slightly separate. Today, she rolled up her sleeves and asked what needed doing. The children stared at her fine dress, but she knelt in the dust and began mending a torn blanket without a care for the stains. By the time the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, she had taught 3 little girls to stitch, read a story to a circle of wide-eyed boys, and organized a pantry that had been in chaos. Mrs. Tibbet wept with gratitude, but Alara only smiled. For the first time in months, she felt useful, not merely decorative. When she returned to Ashwood Hall at dusk, tired and content, the Duke was waiting in the entrance hall. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or irritation. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice measured. "The household was informed you left without a maid." Alara met his eyes. "I walked to the village. There was work to be done." "You are the Duchess of Ashford. You have no need to labor among the villagers." "I disagree, Your Grace." Her voice was calm, but there was a new steadiness in it. She did not apologize. She did not lower her gaze. She simply nodded and moved past him toward the staircase, her heart pounding but her shoulders straight. He said nothing more, but she felt his stare on her back long after she disappeared around the corner. It was the first time he had truly looked at her in months, and it had taken her absence to draw his attention. The days that followed began a slow, quiet transformation. Alara stopped arranging her schedule around the Duke's unpredictable presence. She stopped waiting outside his study. She stopped dressing for dinners he might or might not attend. Instead, she poured her energy into the estate's forgotten corners. She discovered that the tenant farms were struggling, that several families were near starvation due to a poor harvest. She visited them herself, sitting in their cramped cottages, listening to their stories, and she began to quietly use her own funds to purchase grain and medicine. The money was from the small inheritance her mother had left her, a sum the Duke's solicitor had placed in her name with no restriction. She spent it without hesitation, telling no one. It was not charity for show, it was survival for people she was learning to love. The staff began to notice. Mrs. Finch, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Ashford family for 4 decades, watched Alara with growing respect. One evening she brought a cup of warm milk to the Duchess's sitting room and said, soft and low, "Your Grace is doing more good than has been done in this house for many years. The tenants speak your name with blessing." Alara's eyes filled with unexpected tears, but she only thanked the woman and continued writing letters to a physician she hoped to bring to the village. Meanwhile, the Duke's world remained orderly and cold. Cale Ashford was a man who had built his life on control. His first marriage had been a political alliance, childless and distant, and when his wife died of fever, he had felt only a hollow relief. He had sworn never to entangle his emotions again. Marrying Alara had been a matter of honor. Her father had saved his life in battle years ago, and on his deathbed, the old soldier had extracted a promise. Cale kept promises. But he had not expected Alara to be so quietly luminous, nor had he expected her to stir feelings he had long buried. So he had kept her at a distance, convinced that if he allowed even a sliver of warmth, he would lose control entirely. He told himself she was content with the arrangement. He told himself she wanted only his title. He was wrong, and he was too stubborn to see it. The first crack in his armor came at the Lichfield ball, 3 months after the forgotten anniversary. Alara had attended because duty required it, standing beside him in a gown of soft lavender that made her look like a spring morning. She smiled politely at the endless parade of titled guests, but her smile was different now. Not the eager, hopeful expression she used to wear, but something serene and unreachable. She no longer leaned toward him. She did not linger at his elbow or seek his gaze across the room. She drifted through the ballroom with a calm that made him uneasy. Then Lord Henry Marbrook arrived. Henry was Cale's cousin, a man of easy charm and open laughter, everything Cale was not. He had traveled abroad for years and returned with a sun-browned face and an informal manner that made the matrons flutter their fans. The moment Henry saw Alara, his eyes lit with unmistakable admiration. He crossed the room, bowed over her hand, and began speaking to her with such genuine warmth that several heads turned. Cale watched from across the room, a glass of wine growing warm in his hand. He saw Alara's polite smile become something brighter. He saw her laugh, actually laugh, at something Henry said. The sound traveled across the ballroom like a bell, and Cale realized he had never once made her laugh, not once in 2 years. A cold, unfamiliar sensation coiled in his chest. It was not anger, it was something far more dangerous. It was the fear of being replaced by someone who had not earned the right to stand beside her. He was still trying to name the feeling when Lady Margaret Ashworth glided to his side. Beautiful, calculating, and once rumored to be a future Duchess herself, she placed a gloved hand on his arm and murmured, "Your little wife seems quite taken with your cousin. How charming that she has found a friend." Her smile was sharp. Cale said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He spent the rest of the evening watching Alara and Henry dance 2 waltzes while he stood frozen on the edge of the ballroom, a duke made invisible by his own neglect. On the carriage ride home, the silence was oppressive. Alara sat across from him, her cheeks still flushed from dancing, her eyes thoughtful. She did not attempt to fill the quiet with nervous chatter as she once would have. She simply looked out the window at the moonlit countryside, her hands folded in her lap. Cale's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough. "You seem to enjoy my cousin's company." She turned her head slowly. "Yes, he was very kind." "Kind." He repeated the word as though it tasted bitter. "Many men can be kind when they want something." Alara's expression did not change. "He wanted nothing but conversation, Your Grace, a thing I have learned to live without." The words were not spoken with malice. They were simple, honest, and they struck Cale harder than any accusation could have. He said nothing for the rest of the ride, but later that night, alone in his study, he stared at the dying fire and felt the cold truth settle over him. He had starved her of the very thing she deserved, and now someone else was offering it freely. The days that followed became a slow torture for the Duke. Alara continued her quiet work among the tenants, rising early and returning only when the sky was dark. She was never rude, never cold, but the warmth she used to reserve for him had vanished. She treated him with the gracious courtesy of a stranger. She inquired after his health, saw that his household ran smoothly, and then disappeared into her own world of orphanage visits and village meetings. She did not seek him out. She did not linger when their paths crossed. She had become a ghost in his house, and he was the one haunting the halls, straining to catch the sound of her voice. Henry Marbrook, unfortunately for Cale's peace of mind, had extended his stay in the neighborhood. He called at Ashwood Hall frequently, always with a book Alara might enjoy or a basket of fruit from a local farmer. He accompanied her on walks through the gardens. He made her laugh again, and each time Cale would appear at a window or a doorway, watching with an expression of controlled torment. The servants exchanged knowing glances. Mrs. Finch, who had once pitied the Duchess, now watched the Duke with something approaching satisfaction. It was about time, her old eyes seemed to say, that he felt what he had inflicted. But the real storm was gathering beneath the surface, fueled by a man neither the Duke nor the Duchess truly suspected. Mr. Thorne, the estate steward, was a man of precise manners and hidden resentments. He had served Ashwood Hall for 15 years, and he had long believed that his loyalty should have earned him a higher station. He despised the Duchess for winning a place he felt should have gone to someone of his choosing. Moreover, he had been secretly siphoning funds from the estate for years, covering his tracks with falsified ledgers. The Duchess's involvement with the tenants terrified him. If she looked too closely at the accounts, she might discover his theft. He needed to remove her influence. So he began a careful campaign of whispers. It started with small things. A misplaced document suggesting the Duchess had overspent on village charity. A word to a visiting lord that the young Duchess was perhaps too familiar with the tenants. Then, bolder, a forged letter placed among the estate correspondence, hinting that Alara had been secretly corresponding with a London solicitor about separating her finances from the Duke. The letter never reached Cale directly. It was found by a footman and brought to the steward, who, with an expression of deep reluctance, presented it to the Duke. Cale read it in his study, his face turning to stone. He did not want to believe it, but the seed of doubt had been planted in soil already poisoned by jealousy. He began to watch Alara with suspicion, and the distance between them grew into a chasm. Then came the night of the storm. A fierce gale swept the countryside, tearing branches from trees and flooding the road to the village. Alara had been at the orphanage when the worst of it struck. By the time she started back, the path was nearly impassable. She arrived at Ashwood Hall soaked to the bone, shivering, her dress torn where a branch had caught it. The Duke was standing in the hall, his face pale with an emotion she could not read. When he saw her, something in him seemed to snap. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice carrying a raw edge she had never heard before. "Do you have any idea? I sent men out into this to find you. I thought you had been hurt, or worse." She stared at him, dripping onto the marble floor. "I was at the orphanage. The roof was leaking. I stayed to help move the children to safety." "You should have sent word. You should not have been there alone." "I am never alone, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I am simply not with you." She moved to walk past him, but he caught her wrist. It was the first time he had voluntarily touched her in months, and the shock of his grip, gentle but unyielding, stopped her cold. His gray eyes searched her face as though looking for something he had lost. "You could have died," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. I would not." He did not finish the sentence. He released her wrist and stepped back, visibly struggling to contain himself. For one suspended moment she saw it, the fear, the desperate, locked-away fear, and then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask. "Go and dry yourself," he ordered, and turned away. She climbed the stairs with her heart pounding, not knowing what to believe. The next morning, Mr. Thorne struck his final blow. He arrived in the Duke's study with a grave expression and a ledger that, he claimed, showed evidence that the Duchess had been diverting estate funds to a private account in the village. The numbers were carefully falsified, and the account belonged to Thorne himself, but he had paid a local clerk to name the Duchess on a forged document. Cale stared at the papers, and his world tilted. The woman he had begun to realize he loved, the woman he had pushed away so cruelly, was this betrayal real? Jealousy, fear, and his own deep guilt warred within him. He did not sleep that night. He paced his study, reading and rereading the papers until dawn. When he confronted Alara the next day, his voice was colder than she had ever heard it. He laid the documents before her in the morning room and asked, "What is the meaning of this?" She looked at them, confusion turning to disbelief. "I have never seen these before," she said. "I have taken nothing from this estate. I have only given what was my own." "Your own," he laughed, a bitter sound. "You arrived with little more than a trunk of old gowns. How could you be funding anything unless you took it from here?" She flinched as though he had struck her. "My mother's inheritance," she whispered. "I sold her necklace. I sold the silver. Every penny I have spent in the village has come from my own sacrifice, not from you." Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady. "I have never asked you for a farthing beyond my allowance, and even that I have barely touched. I have been feeding your starving tenants while you sat in this house unaware, and you dare accuse me of theft." The words landed like stones in a still pond. The room fell utterly silent. Cale stared at her, and for the first time he truly saw her, not the timid girl he had married, but a woman of fierce dignity, exhausted and heartbroken, yet standing tall. Before he could respond, Alara turned and left the room, her footsteps swift and final. He should have followed. He should have fallen to his knees, but pride and confusion held him in place. 2 days passed in a strained, aching quiet. Alara did not leave her chambers. She wrote letters, made arrangements. She had sent word to the Archbishop's office through a trusted solicitor, requesting an annulment on the grounds that the marriage had never been consummated and was entered into under false pretenses of mutual affection. She had no more hope to give. She would retreat to a small cottage on the edge of the estate, a property her father had once owned, and she would live quietly, far from the cold grandeur of Ashwood Hall. On the third day, the truth about Mr. Thorne unraveled. One of the young clerks at the village bank, stricken by conscience, came to the great house and confessed to the forgeries. Thorne was arrested, his embezzlement exposed. Letters were found in his quarters, correspondence with Alara's own aunt, the bitter woman who had resented the Duke's marriage to her niece because it prevented her from claiming the family inheritance. The conspiracy had been in motion from the start. Cale learned all of this in a single, devastating afternoon. He stood in his study, the truth laid bare, and felt the ground fall away beneath him. He had accused an innocent woman. He had broken the heart of the one person who had ever loved him without wanting anything in return. But the final blow came when Mrs. Finch, her old eyes wet, pressed a small package into his hands. "I thought you should see this, Your Grace." The Duchess left it behind when she began packing. Inside was a worn velvet pouch and a stack of receipts. The pouch held the few remaining coins of her inheritance, mere pennies now. The receipts recorded payments for grain, for medicine, for the doctor who had saved 3 tenant children from fever. On the back of one receipt in her delicate handwriting was a note, "For the little ones so they might sleep without hunger. May they know someone cares." Cale's hand shook. He had been a blind, proud fool, and the woman he had ignored for 2 years had been the heart of his estate all along. He found her in her chambers, a small trunk packed at the foot of the bed. She was wearing a simple traveling cloak, her hair pinned back without adornment. When she saw him enter, she did not look surprised. She only said, "I assume you have learned the truth. I am glad for your sake. I am leaving this afternoon." Cale crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped before her, his chest heaving. "Ilara." Her name on his lips was a plea. "I was wrong. I was blind and cruel, and I accused you of monstrous things. I have no right to ask your forgiveness, but I am asking. I am begging." She shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "You did not trust me. For 2 years I tried to earn a single kind look from you, and you gave me nothing. And the moment doubt appeared, you believed the worst of me. How can I stay with a man who does not know my heart?" "Because I know it now." His voice broke. "I know you sold your mother's jewels to feed strangers. I know you knelt in the mud to mend a child's blanket. I know you faced a storm to save orphans. I know you loved me when I was unlovable. And I know that I love you, Alara. I have loved you for longer than I ever allowed myself to admit, and the thought of losing you is a terror worse than any I have ever faced." She turned her face away, her shoulders trembling. "You say that now because I am leaving." "No." He took her hand, and this time she did not pull away. "I say it because you have been the sun in this house, and I have lived in shadow by my own choice. My first marriage was cold. My parents' union was a battlefield. I swore I would never be vulnerable again. But you broke through without ever raising your voice. You showed me what goodness looks like. And I am so desperately sorry it took the threat of losing you to tear the blindness from my eyes." He reached into his coat and withdrew a worn, folded letter. "This was your father's last letter to me. I have kept it locked away for years. Read it." She unfolded it with numb fingers. The words swam before her eyes. Her father wrote of his gratitude, of his hope that Cale would be a husband not only in name but in heart. And the final line, "Protect her, cherish her, and if you ever find yourself capable, love her as I have loved her. She is the best of me." Alara's tears fell onto the paper. "You promised him," she whispered. "All this time you promised him." "And I failed." Cale's voice was raw. "I failed you and I failed him. But I am here now, on my knees in every way that matters, asking for a chance to do what I should have done from the first moment I saw you. Let me love you, Alara. Let me try." She was silent for a long time. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire. Then slowly she reached up and touched his cheek with fingertips that were still cool from her earlier despair. "I am so tired," she confessed. "Tired of fighting alone. Tired of hopping and being crushed. I do not know if I have any hope left." "Then let me carry the hope for us both," he said, covering her hand with his own. "Stay, not as my Duchess in title, but as my partner, my heart. I will spend every day proving to you that you are seen, that you are cherished. Give me that chance and I will never let you feel invisible again." In the end, she did not leave that afternoon. The trunk was unpacked, not by servants but by the Duke himself, who insisted on carrying her belongings back to their places. He did not retreat to his study that night. Instead, they sat together in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own, and he listened to her speak of the village, of the orphanage, of her plans for a proper school. He asked questions. He remembered names. And for the first time, the silence between them was not empty but full of a fragile, trembling hope. The healing took time. There were days when old wounds ached, when Alara would fall quiet and Kale would see the shadow of past neglect in her eyes. But he courted her as he had never courted anyone. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow. He read to her in the evenings, his deep voice stumbling over poetry until she laughed and corrected him. He walked with her to the village and knelt beside her to help plant a garden for the orphanage. The tenants, who had long loved their invisible Duchess, now watched their Duke transform before their eyes, and they whispered that Ashwood Hall had finally found its heart. 1 year later, on the evening of their third wedding anniversary, the great hall blazed with candlelight. The Duke had arranged a celebration, not a grand ball for society, but a gathering of the people who mattered. The orphans sang a song they had practiced for weeks. The tenant farmers presented a carved wooden bowl as a gift. Henry Marbrook, who had long since become a true friend to both, raised a glass in a warm toast. And in the center of it all stood Alara, wearing a gown of soft gold, her face lit with a joy she had once believed she would never feel. Kale took her hand before the assembled guests and spoke words he had prepared for days. "I once married a stranger out of duty," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "But I fell in love with a woman who deserved far more than I gave. Tonight, before everyone we hold dear, I want to say what I should have said from the start. Alara, you are my home. You are my conscience. You are the love I never knew I was capable of, and I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of you." She did not try to hold back her tears. She stepped into his embrace and the hall erupted in applause. But the truest sound was the one only she could hear, the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her cheek, a rhythm that finally matched her own. They had traveled through pain, hope, distance, jealousy, regret, fear, and confession. And now, at last, there was healing. There was peace. There was love, not as a distant dream, but as a living, breathing, everyday choice. And in the quiet of their chambers later that night, with the moonlight spilling across the floor, Kale took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, her eyelids, the corner of her mouth. "Thank you," he murmured, "for not giving up on me before I learned to see." She smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I almost did," she admitted, "but I am very glad I stayed." Outside, the nightingale sang, and inside, two hearts beat as one, finally, fully, and forever.